Hey guys, tonight we're going to walk a dusty, winding road alongside a group of people who had nothing but a dream, a wagon, and a lot of courage. You're going to feel the sun on your neck and the grit in your teeth as you trudge through the plains of the American West. We're going to talk about the Oregon Trail, but not just the romantic, sun-drenched part of it. We're going to talk about winter, the kind of winter that doesn't just bring a chill, but brings a total, life-threatening stop to everything you know. The kind of cold that makes you question every single decision you've ever made. The kind of situation that, let's be honest, you probably won't survive. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. It's the early 1840s, and a fever has gripped the American East. It's a fever for land, for a fresh start, for a place where you can stake your own claim and build a life free from the suffocating poverty and social structures of the settled states. This is the era of manifest destiny, the belief that America was destined to expand westward. The destination? A place called Oregon, a land of fertile valleys and seemingly endless promise. But to get there, you had to cross nearly 2,000 miles of wilderness. And to do it, you had to leave at exactly the right time. The pioneers called it the Great Migration, and it wasn't something you could just decide to do on a whim. The window was narrow, unforgiving. You had to leave in the early spring, usually around late April or early May, from a jumping-off point like Independence, Missouri. Why so precise? Well, the journey was a 6-month trek, and you absolutely had to get through the mountain passes, the towering, formidable Rockies, and the even more treacherous Blue Mountains before the first snows of late fall. Historians still argue about whether the pioneers fully understood the unforgiving nature of the trail, or if a sense of almost blind optimism drove them forward. You, as a pioneer, know this. You've heard the stories, read the guidebooks. You've spent months, maybe even a year, saving up and preparing. The urgency is a constant, low-level hum in your mind. Every day is a race against the calendar. A day of bad weather, a broken axle, a stray cow. Any of these could be the difference between a new life in Oregon and a frozen grave in a snow-choked pass. This is why you see families selling everything they own, pooling their resources and packing up their lives into a single wooden wagon. The sheer scale of this movement is staggering. At its peak, tens of thousands of people were making this journey annually. It was a mass exodus, a wave of humanity moving westward with a shared, desperate purpose. There's a peculiar tidbit here. Many guidebooks from the time actually underestimated the total travel time by a significant margin, contributing to the perilous rush to get to Oregon before winter. It was a kind of tragic misinformation, a detail that would haunt many a family caught in the high mountains when the first blizzards hit. You see, the trail isn't just a path. It's a living, breathing entity that dictates its own rules. And its most important rule is this: you don't mess with winter. So you've made it past the initial frenetic rush of leaving civilization behind. You're part of a wagon train, a small, self-contained moving city. And your wagon, that simple canvas-covered box on wheels, is your entire world. It's your home, your pantry, and your hope for the future. You've packed it with everything you think you'll need for a 6-month journey. But what do you pack for a journey like this? Well, you start with the basics, of course. Sacks of flour, a good supply of bacon, coffee, and sugar. These are the fuel that will keep you going. Then there's the gear. A good rifle for hunting, tools for repairs, a Dutch oven for cooking. You're told to pack light, but when you're leaving everything behind, the definition of light gets a little fuzzy. You see families trying to bring along their grandmother's rocking chairs, heavy trunks filled with delicate china, or even massive cast iron stoves. These are the luxuries of the old life, the things that remind them of where they came from. But out here, they're just dead weight. The reality of the trail quickly sets in, and you learn to distinguish between what is essential and what is a liability. That rocking chair, it gets tossed onto the side of the trail a few 100 miles in. That heavy trunk, it's abandoned next to a river crossing. The trail becomes a kind of long, winding graveyard of possessions, a monument to the harsh lessons learned about what truly matters. Historians still argue whether the pioneers' initial optimism was a product of naivety or a necessary mental armor for facing such an impossible task. Either way, the trail has a way of stripping you bare, both literally and figuratively. As you move farther west, you learn to live with less, to see value in things you once took for granted, like a sturdy pair of shoes or a fresh-drawn bucket of water. The wagons themselves were a marvel of pragmatic engineering. A standard prairie schooner, as they were sometimes called, was essentially a large farm wagon with a wooden body and a canvas cover stretched over bows. The wheels were often made of hickory or oak and bound with iron tires. But they were not invincible. A broken axle could mean a multi-day delay, a dangerous proposition when you're racing against the calendar. A peculiar tidbit: many wagons were not pulled by horses, but by oxen. Oxen were slower, sure, but they were stronger, more resilient to the harsh conditions, and could subsist on the scrub grass found along the trail. Plus, in a desperate situation, an ox could be a source of food, something you couldn't say for a horse you'd just spent a fortune on. You're now a part of this endless, groaning line of wagons, the sound of the wooden wheels on the dirt, a constant soundtrack to your life. The sun beats down, the dust chokes you, and you learn that the real journey isn't just about getting to Oregon, it's about the minute-by-minute struggle of simply staying on the move. The first few months on the trail are a blur of sun-drenched plains and a relentless, plodding pace. You've settled into a routine. The day starts early, often before dawn, with the smell of wood smoke and coffee filling the air. You unhitch the oxen, gather the kindling, and share a breakfast of bacon and stale bread. Then the day's march begins, a slow, steady trudge that lasts until the late afternoon. You walk alongside your wagon, the dust billowing up around your ankles, the rhythmic creak of the wheels a constant companion. There's a certain kind of beauty to it, a sense of shared purpose and open space. The landscapes you pass through are breathtakingly vast. Rolling prairies that seem to stretch on forever, rivers that cut through the land like veins, and sunsets that paint the sky in hues you never knew existed. But it's not all picturesque. There are dangers, too. River crossings are particularly treacherous. You watch as wagons get stuck in the mud or, worse, get swept away by a swift current. You hear stories of people drowning, of possessions lost forever to the depths. And then there are the illnesses. Cholera is a constant threat, its invisible presence a source of quiet dread. A simple cut can lead to a deadly infection, and a fever can turn fatal in a matter of days. You learn to live with a certain level of danger, a kind of resigned acceptance that not everyone who started this journey with you will finish it. This initial phase of the journey is marked by a kind of stubborn optimism, a belief that as long as you keep moving, you'll be okay. Historians still argue about whether this early period was a honeymoon phase or if the constant low-level stress was already taking its toll on the pioneers' health and psyche. The real challenge is the monotony. Day after day, the routine is the same. You eat, you walk, you sleep, and you do it all again. It's a test of endurance, both physical and mental. You learn to find small joys, a clear stream for washing, a chance encounter with a friendly family from another wagon train, a letter from home that's been passed along the trail. There's a peculiar tidbit here about trail communication. Pioneers would often leave messages for those behind them, writing on buffalo skulls or carving into trees. These messages ranged from warnings about bad water to simple greetings and updates on their progress. It was a way of staying connected in a world of vast emptiness, a ghostly chain of communication linking the thousands of people who followed the same path. You're starting to get a sense of the scale of this journey, the sheer distance that lies between you and your destination. And you know, deep down, that this easy part of the journey can't last forever. The sun is starting to get a little lower in the sky, and the air is just a little crisper in the mornings. You can feel the change coming. As the weeks turn into months, the landscape begins to shift. The endless green prairies of the Great Plains start to give way to something else entirely. You see the first hints of a more rugged, unforgiving world. The land becomes rockier, the ground less fertile, and the trees start to thin out. You're entering the high country, and with it, the undeniable signs of looming winter. The air, once thick with the buzzing of insects, now has a certain crispness to it. The sun sets earlier, and you find yourself huddling closer to the campfire at night, pulling your thin blanket tighter around you. This is the part of the journey that separates the prepared from the unprepared, the lucky from the unlucky. The calendar in your mind is now the most important possession you have. You know you're racing a clock you can't see, and every day that passes without reaching a major landmark, like Fort Laramie or the Platte River, is another day you're gambling with your life. The psychological shift is palpable. The jovial optimism of the early trail days fades, replaced by a grim determination. Conversations around the campfire are less about the future and more about the immediate challenges. How much food do we have left? Did you hear about the family whose oxen are getting sick? You start to notice the subtle signs of nature that have been warning you all along. The leaves on the few trees you see are starting to turn, not with the gentle reds and golds of an eastern autumn, but with a harsh, brittle brown. The wind, which was once a gentle breeze, now feels like a physical force, cutting through your clothes and chilling you to the bone. This is not the idyllic fall you remember from back home. This is a warning. Historians still debate the specific climate conditions of the mid-19th century, but there's a consensus that the winters in the high country were particularly brutal and unpredictable. A freak snowstorm in September wasn't just a possibility. It was a known and feared reality. A peculiar tidbit from this time is the sheer amount of abandoned goods you would start to see on the trail. As the terrain got rougher and the temperature dropped, wagons became heavier and more difficult to pull. You would see what a month ago was a family's prized possession, a large, heavy desk or an ornate cabinet, now lying broken on the side of the trail. These weren't just objects. They were symbols of the pioneers' slowly evaporating hopes. You start to understand that in this new world, survival is not about what you have, but what you can endure. And as you trudge along, you feel the weight of this understanding in your bones. The easy part is over. Now, the real journey begins. The first truly bitter cold snaps hit you like a physical blow. One morning, you wake up to find a thin skim of ice on the water bucket outside your wagon. The breath plumes from your mouth in white clouds, and the ground beneath your feet is no longer soft earth, but hard frozen dirt. This isn't just a chill. It's a deep, penetrating cold that seeps into your bones and rattles your teeth. The canvas of your wagon, which once offered a flimsy barrier against the sun, now feels utterly useless against the relentless wind. You find yourself pulling your threadbare blanket tighter, trying to steal any bit of warmth from the meager fire. The fear, which had been a low hum, now rises to a crescendo. You glance at your family, their faces drawn and pale, and you see the same terror reflected in their eyes. This is the moment when the true gravity of your situation becomes painfully clear. The optimism that fueled you through the sun-drenched plains has evaporated, replaced by a desperate, gnawing anxiety. Every creak of the wagon, every distant howl of a coyote, sounds like a harbinger of doom. You start to see the desperation in others, too. Arguments break out more frequently, tempers fray, and the sense of community that once bound the wagon train together begins to unravel under the relentless pressure of the elements. You watch as families, once hopeful and vibrant, become shadows of their former selves, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow with exhaustion and fear. This isn't just a journey anymore. It's a brutal test of wills. Historians still argue about the precise psychological toll this constant exposure to extreme weather and uncertainty took on the pioneers. Was it sheer grit that kept them going, or a kind of denial? The decisions you face now are grim. That beloved family heirloom, the one that made it this far, it's now just a heavy obstacle. You see more and more items discarded along the trail: furniture, clothing, even tools. Every pound shed is a tiny victory against the encroaching winter, a desperate attempt to lighten the load on the straining oxen. There's a peculiar tidbit here. Pioneers often smeared axle grease on their faces to protect against the biting wind and sun, creating a strange, dark mask that added to their already haggard appearance. It was a small, practical measure in a world where every advantage counted. You pull your collar higher, trying to block the wind that seems to find every gap in your clothing. The thought of stopping, of giving up, crosses your mind more than once. But you know that stopping means certain death. There's only one direction to go, one choice to make: forward into the unforgiving maw of winter. The land is now a relentless, uphill battle. Every day you are scrambling, not just for miles, but for survival. The first flakes of snow are no longer a distant fear, but a grim reality, a silent herald of the coming deep freeze. You're forced to make even harder choices. The animals are suffering. The grass is gone, replaced by a sparse, brittle scrub that offers little nourishment. You're rationing their food just as you're rationing your own. You see families debating whether to abandon a sick ox, knowing that without it, they'll fall behind. The ethical dilemma is excruciating. But out here, practicality trumps sentimentality. You learn that a living, breathing animal is just another resource, and a sick one is a liability that can doom an entire family. This is the phase of the journey where the wagons start to feel less like homes and more like coffins. The cold seeps in through every crack, and the canvas provides little comfort. You see pioneers huddled around fires, their faces smudged with dirt and desperation, their eyes fixed on the dwindling supply of firewood. The landscape itself is no longer a source of wonder, but a hostile entity. The towering peaks of the mountains loom in the distance, beautiful but deadly, a final, insurmountable barrier. You're no longer just following a path, you're fighting it. The ground is frozen, making it impossible to bury the dead properly. A grim and constant reminder of the trail's toll. Historians still argue whether the high mortality rates were due more to disease or to the sheer exhaustion and malnutrition caused by the relentless pace and harsh conditions. You find yourself doing things you never thought you'd do. You're gathering buffalo chips, dried buffalo dung, to use as fuel for your fires. They burn surprisingly well and are often the only source of heat on the treeless plains. This peculiar tidbit is a perfect example of the kind of resourcefulness that became necessary for survival. The once delicate hands of your wife are now calloused and cracked, her face weathered by the wind and sun. Your children, who were once full of wide-eyed wonder, now trudge along with a quiet, resigned silence. The shared dream that brought you here is now a desperate gamble. And as the days get shorter and the nights get colder, you realize that the most valuable thing you possess isn't your wagon or your supplies, but a fragile, flickering ember of hope. And you have to protect it with everything you have. With winter closing in, the issue of food becomes paramount. The game, once relatively plentiful in the early stages of the trail, has grown scarce. Buffalo herds, if you even encounter them, are skittish and hard to hunt. Your rifle, once a symbol of self-sufficiency, now feels like a heavy, almost useless burden. You're no longer just trying to put meat on the table. You're trying to put anything on the table. Your diet has narrowed to the absolute essentials: flour for hardtack or a thin gruel, a few strips of bacon carefully doled out, and precious, dwindling supplies of coffee and sugar. Scurvy, a grim consequence of vitamin deficiency, begins to set in, manifesting as swollen gums, aching joints, and a profound weariness that even sleep can't alleviate. You watch as others succumb to it, their strength draining away day by day. Foraging becomes a desperate necessity. You learn to identify every edible plant, every root, every berry that might offer a shred of sustenance. You pick through the barren landscape, your eyes scanning for anything that isn't rock or frozen earth. And when you find something, a handful of bitter berries, a few tough roots, it feels like a miraculous bounty. This struggle for food transcends individual families. It becomes a communal burden. Wagon trains, once bound by shared optimism, now face difficult decisions about who gets what and whether to share dwindling resources with those who are truly starving. Historians still argue about the extent of cannibalism on the Oregon Trail, often referring to it in hushed tones, but the dire circumstances certainly pushed some to the absolute brink of human endurance. A quirky tidbit that exemplifies this desperate resourcefulness is the pioneers' ingenuity with buffalo chips, as we discussed. Beyond just fuel, some accounts suggest they were even used as a form of crude insulation when desperate families found themselves without adequate shelter. Imagine gathering handfuls of dried animal waste, not just for warmth but to fill cracks in a makeshift lean-to, a testament to the lengths people would go to survive. You chew slowly on a piece of hardtack, tasting the dust and the desperation. Your stomach aches with a constant dull hunger, and your body feels perpetually cold. The memory of a warm, full meal back home now feels like a distant, impossible dream. Every bite, every morsel, is a victory against the encroaching famine, a tiny step that might just carry you through another day. As the sun gets lower in the sky and the nights grow longer, you realize that your greatest vulnerability isn't hunger or a broken wagon wheel, it's the cold itself. Your clothes, which seemed adequate back in the humid spring, are now a cruel joke against the biting wind. The thin wool and cotton offer little protection, and you find yourself shivering uncontrollably, even when huddled close to the fire. The canvas of the wagon, once a symbol of your journey, feels flimsy and porous, letting in the cold air and any stray snowflakes. You try to insulate your sleeping space with blankets and whatever scraps of fabric you can find, but it's a losing battle. The cold finds a way in, seeping into your bones and making sleep a restless, chattering affair. The struggle for warmth becomes a daily obsession. You spend precious hours foraging for firewood, your hands numb and clumsy. The scarcity of trees in the high plains means that you often have to settle for small, scrubby bushes, or, as you now know, dried buffalo dung. The fires you build are meager, offering a brief respite before the cold reasserts its dominance. You see families trying to create makeshift shelters, digging shallow pits in the ground and covering them with canvas and brush, a desperate attempt to create a pocket of warmth away from the wind. This is the reality of winter on the trail, a constant, exhausting battle against an invisible enemy. Historians still argue about the exact number of deaths on the Oregon Trail attributable to exposure and hypothermia, but it's clear that the harsh winters were a major contributor to the overall mortality rate. A peculiar tidbit from this time is the use of animal hides. While many pioneers brought minimal clothing, some were able to acquire buffalo or deer hides, either through hunting or trading with Native American tribes. These thick, heavy hides, often worn with the fur side in, provided a level of insulation that was far superior to any store-bought clothing. They were a crucial, often life-saving layer of protection against the frigid temperatures. You find yourself dreaming of a warm, dry house with a real fireplace. But for now, your reality is a cold, hard world of constant discomfort. You wrap your arms around yourself, trying to capture your own body heat, and you pray for morning to come quickly. Because in this frozen landscape, every day is a small miracle of survival. The presence of Native Americans along the trail was a complex and often misunderstood aspect of the pioneer experience. You might have arrived with preconceived notions, fueled by sensational stories from back home, but the reality was far more nuanced. For many tribes, the influx of pioneers was a disruption, a steady stream of foreigners cutting through their ancestral lands, disrupting game routes and depleting resources. Yet interactions were not always hostile. Often they were pragmatic and even mutually beneficial. You might encounter groups who were willing to trade fresh game or vital information about water sources for tools, blankets, or even simple trinkets. These were often a lifeline, especially as your own supplies dwindled and the terrain became increasingly harsh. However, conflict was also a grim reality. Sometimes it was born out of misunderstanding or fear. Other times, it stemmed from desperate competition for dwindling resources, especially as winter made hunting more difficult for both pioneers and tribes alike. You hear whispers of raids, of stolen livestock, and sometimes of tragic clashes that ended in bloodshed. The truth, as historians still argue, is that the narrative of constant warfare is an oversimplification. Many tribes attempted to coexist, or at least tolerate, the passage of these strange, wheeled contraptions. A peculiar tidbit: Some Native American tribes even charge tolls at certain river crossings, recognizing the economic opportunity presented by the endless stream of desperate pioneers. It was a stark reminder that this was their land, and you were merely passing through at their discretion. You learned to be constantly vigilant, scanning the horizon for signs of other human presence, whether friendly or hostile. The fear of the unknown is a constant companion, yet you also come to respect the incredible resilience and intimate knowledge these people have of the land. They move with an ease that you, burdened by your wagon and possessions, can only dream of. Their understanding of the winter landscape, of where to find shelter or game, far surpasses anything you could glean from a flimsy guidebook. As the cold deepens, the lines between us and them sometimes blur, replaced by the shared, fundamental human struggle for survival against an indifferent wilderness. The constant, bone-deep cold and relentless hunger take a brutal toll on your body, but it's the smaller, more insidious threats that truly wear you down. Frostbite becomes a constant worry. You wake up in the morning to find your fingers and toes numb, and you have to work quickly to restore circulation, rubbing them vigorously until the painful stinging returns. Infections, which would have been minor back home, can now be deadly. A simple cut on your hand from a piece of firewood can become a festering wound in the unsanitary conditions of the trail. Without proper medical care, it can quickly turn into something far worse, leading to a debilitating fever or even amputation if gangrene sets in. You see families trying to treat these ailments with what little they have. Poultices made from whatever herbs they can identify, or a crude stitch with a needle and thread. Disease is a silent killer that follows the wagon trains relentlessly. Besides the dreaded cholera, other ailments run rampant. Scurvy, as we mentioned, is a real and constant threat, its debilitating effects making even simple tasks feel impossible. And then there are the fevers, often brought on by exposure or contaminated water. A fever in these conditions is a death sentence, as your body, already weakened by hunger and exhaustion, has no resources left to fight. The mortality rate on the Oregon Trail was shockingly high, and historians still debate whether more people died from accidents, like drownings, or being crushed by wagons, or from disease and exposure. A peculiar tidbit about their medical knowledge. Many pioneers believed that wrapping a cut in spider webs would help it heal, a folk remedy passed down through generations. While this may sound strange, it was a desperate attempt to stop bleeding and offer some form of protection against the elements in a world without modern medicine. You look at your hands, cracked and chapped from the cold, and you feel a profound sense of helplessness. There's no doctor to turn to, no pharmacy to visit. You are your own doctor, your own caregiver, and your own last hope. The suffering is not a grand, dramatic event. It's a slow, steady erosion of health and vitality. You watch the children, once rosy-cheeked and full of energy, now pale and quiet, their eyes too old for their faces. The cold and hunger are not just physical threats. They are psychological ones, wearing down your spirit until all that's left is a fierce, almost animalistic instinct to survive. The story of the Donner Party is a grim and unforgettable lesson in what happens when winter on the trail goes wrong in the most spectacular and horrific way. You've heard the whispers around the campfire, hushed tones about a group who got stuck in the Sierras, who didn't make it. But the real story is a chilling reminder of how quickly hope can curdle into desperation. They were a group of families just like yours, who left a bit too late. They made the fateful decision to take a supposed shortcut, a route called the Hastings Cutoff. It was meant to save time, but it ended up costing them months. You hear the fear in the way people talk about it, because you know, deep down, that it could have been you. As winter descended, the Donner Party became trapped by massive snowdrifts in the mountains. Their livestock died, their supplies ran out, and they were forced to take shelter in makeshift cabins, their world shrinking to a freezing, unforgiving cage. Their story is a descent into madness and a struggle for survival that pushed them past all conventional human limits. They were forced to eat their animals, then their leather goods, and finally, some of the group resorted to cannibalism to survive. It's a truth that historians still argue over in its gruesome details, how much, who, and to what extent, but the fact of it remains a stark, terrifying reality. It's a mainstream historical fact that is often glossed over, but on the trail, it's a living ghost, a cautionary tale whispered from one tired, hungry person to another. A peculiar tidbit about the Donner Party is that one of the members, a man named George Donner, had a severe hand injury that made him unable to work, which slowed the entire group down and contributed to their being caught by the early snows. It was a single, seemingly small tragedy that became a catalyst for a much larger one. As you trudge along, you feel the cold biting at your own fingers, and you can't help but think of him. You imagine the weight of the collective survival resting on the shoulders of one man's injury. The Donner Party is more than just a story. It's a profound, chilling answer to the question that haunts every single pioneer who is caught in the cold. What will it take to survive? And as the wind howls around you, you realize you might not want to know the answer. You've made it. After months of grueling travel, after the hunger and the cold and the endless bone-jarring rattle of the wagon wheels, you see it. The signs of civilization. Not the towns you left behind, but a new kind of life. Small settlements begin to appear, then a few farms, and finally, the promise of the Willamette Valley in Oregon. A surge of relief washes over you, so profound it makes your knees weak. You want to cheer, to cry, to fall to your knees and kiss the ground. But the reality is that your arrival isn't the end of your hardships. It's simply a new beginning for them. The journey has taken everything from you, and you are no longer the same person who left home months ago. The celebration is muted, tinged with the quiet grief for those who didn't make it, and the profound weariness that has settled deep in your soul. You're now a settler, but you've arrived in a land that is still wild and untamed. The first challenge is to survive the first winter here. You've just spent months on the trail, and your supplies are exhausted. You have no home, no crops planted, and you have to start from scratch. This is a cruel irony of the Oregon Trail. The finish line is just the starting line for a whole new set of struggles. Historians still argue about the number of pioneers who, upon reaching Oregon, found themselves in a state of near starvation, having to rely on the generosity of earlier settlers or even Native American tribes to survive their first year. The land is fertile, yes, but it doesn't give up its bounty easily. A peculiar tidbit. Many pioneers, upon reaching Oregon, were forced to barter away their last remaining possessions, even their wagons, for food and tools to get through the first winter. The very vehicle that brought them to this promised land often became the first sacrifice of their new life. You look at your wagon, now a battered, mud-caked relic, and you realize its journey, and yours, is not yet over. You're no longer just a traveler. You are now a builder, a farmer, a homesteader. And the hard work has only just begun. But you've seen what you can endure, and you know with a quiet certainty that you can face whatever comes next. Having finally reached what you hope is your new home, the immediate priority shifts from endless travel to establishing some semblance of permanent shelter before the true bite of winter sets in. You're utterly exhausted, but there's no time to rest. You look around at the dense forests and the vast, untamed land, and you realize that every log, every stone, every sod brick will have to be moved by your own weary hands. The first winter camps are often crude, temporary affairs. Some families might dig a dugout, a simple hole in the ground covered with branches and sod, offering minimal protection from the elements. Others might cobble together a lean-to, a rudimentary structure against a large tree or rock formation. The goal is a log cabin, but building one from scratch is an immense undertaking, especially when you're weakened by months on the trail. You learn quickly how to fell trees, how to notch logs so they fit together snugly, and how to chink the gaps with mud and moss to keep out the wind. It's back-breaking work, and every muscle aches. The smoke from your small, newly built fireplace is often your only comfort against the relentless chill. Historians still argue about the sheer amount of physical labor involved in establishing these early homesteads, often overlooking it in favor of the more dramatic journey itself. But for the pioneers, it was a continuous, brutal effort that spanned years. A peculiar tidbit about these early homes: many pioneers initially built sod houses in areas where timber was scarce. Imagine cutting blocks of tough prairie sod, roots and all, and stacking them like bricks to form walls. These soddies, as they were called, were surprisingly warm in winter and cool in summer, offering a simple yet effective refuge from the extreme weather. You find yourself appreciating every small victory: the first solid roof over your head, the first fire that truly warms the space, the first time you don't have to pack up everything at dawn. This isn't just about building a house, it's about rebuilding a life, brick by agonizing brick, or in this case, log by exhausting log. There were some who, despite the urgency, were simply too late. They faced the most brutal form of the winter struggle, and their stories are a testament to the unforgiving nature of the trail. These were the latecomers, the families who had suffered too many delays: a broken wagon, a sick child, a flooded river. They found themselves still on the road when the first blizzards hit the high mountain passes. The passes, like the dreaded Blue Mountains, were the final, towering obstacles. Once an early snow fell, these trails became impassable, a labyrinth of snowdrifts and ice. You can almost feel their terror, the moment they realize they are trapped, with a wall of white in front of them and a wall of white behind them. For these latecomers, the struggle for survival became a terrifying race against time and the elements. Wagons were abandoned entirely, their contents left to be buried under feet of snow. Families were forced to huddle together in caves or under rock overhangs, their only hope being to hold out until a rescue party could reach them, an event that was far from guaranteed. Stories from this time describe families eating their animals, their leather goods, anything to stave off starvation. It's a cruel twist of fate that the most tragic events on the trail were often the result of being just a few weeks behind schedule. Historians still argue about whether these late starts were due to poor planning or simply a series of unavoidable misfortunes. A peculiar tidbit: one of the more gruesome practices that latecomers resorted to was using their deceased animals' hides not just for warmth, but as a form of sustenance. The hides were boiled for days to create a gelatinous soup that provided a small amount of calories, a desperate and bitter meal to keep them alive. You feel a pang of sympathy for these lost souls caught in a frozen purgatory, a grim reminder of the thin line between a new life and a forgotten grave. You are thankful for the roof over your head, no matter how crude it may be. Their suffering is a stark, silent warning that echoes through the trees, a memory that you will carry with you for the rest of your life. So, you've survived the trail. You've survived the first brutal winter in your new home, and you've laid down roots. But the story of the pioneers and their struggle against the winter isn't just a personal memory. It's a foundational part of American history and folklore. The tales of their resilience, their courage, and their sometimes horrifying choices shaped the very identity of the West. Their stories were passed down through generations, becoming a kind of mythic bedrock for the values of grit and self-reliance that are still celebrated today. But the legacy is complex. We remember the heroes and the triumphs, but we often gloss over the pain, the profound loss, and the devastating environmental impact of their mass migration. Today you can still trace their footsteps. The Oregon National Historic Trail exists as a physical and historical marker, a winding path that you, in your imagination, just traversed. Along the trail, archaeologists are still making discoveries, small tidbits that bring the past to life. A rusted buckle, a discarded cooking pot, the remains of a wagon wheel. Each one is a tiny clue, a piece of a puzzle that historians are still trying to solve. Historians still argue about the true cost of this westward expansion, not just in human lives, but in the displacement of Native American tribes and the irrevocable changes to the landscape. A peculiar tidbit. One of the most famous landmarks on the trail, Independence Rock in Wyoming, is covered in thousands of carved names from pioneers who passed through. It was a kind of primitive social media, a way of leaving a mark on the world, a testament to the fact that they were here, that they survived. As you look out at your new home, you realize that your story is now part of this larger narrative. The struggles of the past are not just memories. They are the foundation upon which your future is built. You're not just a pioneer. You're a link in a chain, a living testament to a time when courage and endurance were the only currencies that mattered. And as you settle in for the long night, you know that your journey and your story will continue to echo through the years. The fire is burning low now, its light a soft, gentle glow against the darkness. The air inside your small cabin is finally warm, a comfort you no longer take for granted. The wind whispers outside, a soft, familiar sound now, not a threat. The world outside is a blanket of quiet, and the stars are starting to come out, so many of them. A slow, gentle shimmer in the vast, still night. The aches and pains of the day are fading, turning into a dull hum in your bones, a constant reminder of everything you've overcome. Close your eyes now. The long journey is over. There's nothing left to worry about. Just the warmth of the fire, the quiet of the night, and the soft, gentle feeling of rest.